So, hi everyone. This is going to be hard because I was told that I'm supposed to stay in the line of sight. And last summer they had me teach one of our 600 people bachelor courses. So they gave me the large auditorium. And I had like 30 meters. And I spent most of the 90 minutes walking from one end to another because there were also 4 screens where I could see my slides. So there wasn't any reason to stand around. So now trying to stay more or less in one spot will be a bit of a challenge, but I'm really going to try for you. So anyway, today I'm going to talk about my recent work on blockchain scalability. And if you're worried that this will be a very researchy talk, it actually came up because Patrick and Arthur, whom you see on the slides, at some point, they're fed up with explaining all the people we meet again and again what the basics of payment channel networks are. And we were losing the overview because there was so much new stuff coming out. So we thought we actually need to have a paper that gives a really good summary on what is out there. Now the 4 of us had just started either professor or senior researcher positions, and we had no time. But Arthur had a PhD student, that is Lewis. So Lewis had to do all the work in summarizing, and the remaining 4 people here were mainly complaining about him not being clear enough or not including certain works. So the result is what I think is a very concise summary on what you can do with off-chain transactions and how they make blockchains more scalable. So let's get started. That was one too fast. That also. Okay, now we've got it. So why do we need off-chain transactions? Actually, there are tons of reasons why the standard blockchain structure that is used in Bitcoin and Ethereum is not quite what we need. First of all, there are these endless delays. In Bitcoin, you might have to wait an hour before you get a confirmation. You don't want to buy your coffee with Bitcoin given those restrictions. Another one is that you have to pay fees that at some points can be quite high in comparison to using a debit card. You lose all of your privacy because we have this nice blockchain explorers that can essentially figure out what is going on in the chain and trace it back to you. And you have your whole transaction history, which before was only known to you and your bank, online for everyone to see. And the number of transactions that Bitcoin and other proof-of-work blockchains can handle is very low. It's also not particularly energy efficient, at least if you're using proof of work. Proof of stake is a bit better. So for all of these problems, off-chain transactions present key solutions. So what is the idea of an off-chain transaction? Let's first talk about terminology here. The idea is you still have the blockchain. You keep it as it was before, but you can somehow make transactions without invoking the consensus algorithm of the blockchain for every transaction. So you tie these transactions in some way to the blockchain, but we are not conducting them on the blockchain. Or at least it's not immediately recorded on the blockchain. One interesting aspect in our definition is that we're talking about transactions that do not have their own consensus protocol. So a sidechain, where you're having a second consensus that is somehow linked to the first consensus of the blockchain, is, according to our definition, we can decide that not an off-chain transaction. So it's only if there is no separate consensus protocol for the purpose of this talk. So what types of off-chain transactions do we have? Well, the main part of this talk will be about payment or state channel networks. What is the difference? Well, essentially a payment network is something where you do payments. A state channel network also allows you to use smart contracts. We will mainly use payment channel networks as an example simply because it's a bit easier to illustrate. But everything that I say is similarly applicable to state channel networks. So here the idea is that you and some other party establish like a local so-called channel, and then you will perform transactions in this channel, and we will see in what are the cryptographic primitives that allow us to do so. This is not the only off-chain solution, but it's the most popular one. Okay. Another one is what is called commit chains. Here the idea is essentially that you delegate transactions to an operator, which can then summarize them in a more compact fashion, and you're gaining some throughput by simply not putting the transaction on the chain immediately. But you still put it on the chain, so the gain is actually limited. So we're going to stay with the payment channel networks. And let's start by what is a channel, then we're going to discuss what a network is, and then we're going to have a short summary. So how does it start? Well, if you remember the initial definition of off-chain, we somehow want to tie our off-chain transaction to the blockchain so that we can use the underlying security guarantees of the blockchain. For this, you need a funding transaction. In this funding transaction, let's say 2 parties, you can potentially do that with more, but 2 parties is the standard, lock a certain amount of coins, for example, Bitcoins, into the channel. So in this example, A decides to lock X coin, and B decides to lock Y coins. Then you have this channel and you have the balance. The balance at the moment means A can send up to X coins to B, and B can send up to Y coins to A. You could also have that only unidirectional, but most of the newer payment channel networks are bidirectional. Now imagine that A wants to pay B Z coins. Now for this operation, the blockchain is no longer needed. Everything that happens is that A and B will sign certain proofs that this transaction happened. The type of the proof depends on what type of blockchain and state channel system you have. And then the balance along the channel will change to X minus Z for A side, and B gets the extra Z, so it's Y plus Z. And A can do that again, so A can say, now I'm paying B another W coins, as long as this is within the balance of the channel, as long as we don't go below 0, this is all fine. And it can be repeated in both directions as often as you want. At some point, A and B will probably be tired of having their coins locked up in this channel because they cannot use it for anything else. Then they will have a closing transaction, and then they receive whatever the current balance of the channel is. Now this sounds nice. What is if A and B disagree on what the value of the channel is? Well, for example, A can say, I never did a second transaction, so the balance of the channel is that I should still get X minus Z coins. While B says, well, no, you did the second transaction, I get X plus Z plus W coins. Well, the key idea here is, and again there are multiple implementations of this, but the idea is that the 2 parties have to publish their most recent state to the blockchain. There has to be some identifier in the signed transactions that they made. If both parties publish this information, the consensus of the blockchain can figure out which one is the most recent one, and then the amounts that are paid out correspond to the correct state. One problem here is, of course, if A and B do not have the opportunity to prevent their evidence because of the blockchain might be congested. So that's an open issue that to some extent cannot be solved. But in the absence, if the blockchain indeed allows everyone to present their evidence, then we're having the case that everything nicely worked out. The blockchain could figure out what the correct state was, and B gets the coins that they are supposed to get. So this is nice, but it has a couple of problems. So first, if you really want to go into this in detail, those are all the protocols that exist for realizing these disputes and commitments. So that's about 10. So I'm going to do you a favor and not talk about each of them for like an hour. But you can look them up in our paper or in the official publication. The thing that everyone should note here is we still need two blockchain operations. We need the funding of the channel and we need the closing. So having a payment channel with someone only makes sense if you really have multiple transactions. At least 3. Otherwise, you can just do it via the normal blockchain. Which means for the supermarket close to my university where I usually buy whatever I still need for dinner, this is great because I'm going there every second day. I don't mind locking some coins, and I do not mind paying. For an airport cafe on a place that I visit once, this is not what I want to use, not in this particular form. So does that mean that payment or state channels are limited to regular transactions? No, it does not. The solution you have for still doing a transaction with someone with whom you only transact once is that you don't make the transaction directly, but you have multiple of these channels. They can be connected into a network, and you just pay along a pass in the respective network. Did the clicker saying? Nope. So essentially imagine A and C A wants to pay C, but it's only a one-time thing. It's the airport cafe that I go to once. It doesn't make sense for me to open a payment channel. Now, A and C might both have a channel with this intermediary node B. And this node B might be willing to forward the coins in exchange for a small fee F. So what happens now is that A sends Z plus F coins to B, and B sends the remaining set after subtracting the fee to the node C, and then A and C did their payment, and they did not actually need to open a channel. Now there are two questions here that need to be answered for this to be possible. First of all, how do we make sure that B does not just keep the money? Second question is, this looks easy, but if you have a large-scale network, how do you know if you have a path to someone else? How do you know what it looks like? How do you find it in an efficient and effective manner? Those are the two key research challenges in the area of payment or state channel networks. Now, the standard answer for channel synchronization or for making sure that B does not actually steal the money of A is hash time lock contracts, and they work roughly like this. You first have the node C. C generates the hash value of a randomly chosen value. Now this is a cryptographically secure hash function. So if you get a value H, it's essentially impossible or close to impossible to guess the pre-image R. What happens now is that C sends it to B, and B forwards it to A. The next step is that A initiates some sort of promise, which is identified by the value H, a time T, and the value Z plus F. So what these three numbers essentially mean is A tells B that if you give me a pre-image to H within time T, then I give you this value Z plus F. And that's cryptographically signed, so it can later be proven that A made this specific promise. And B does something similar with C. It still has the same value H. It has a different timeout because it needs to be able to still have the time after getting a response from C to forward it to A. So the timeout will be different. And the promised value will be different because it keeps the fee F. And then if everything works as it should, you're just forwarding the pre-image back along the path, and there's no incentive for B to not forward it because then it will not get its money from A, but it needs to pay C. So this is how it works in the Lightning Network. This is roughly how it works in Raiden and all the other ones. It's a decent protocol, apart from these couple of issues, like high latency. There is a security attack if you manage to get 2 malicious parties on a pass. There are privacy issues. And it doesn't really work well if you have an intermediary that might be offline for some time or not willing to sign everything. The good news is, academically, there are solutions to these issues. They are just not implemented yet, partially because something like Bitcoin lacks the necessary structure for certain aspects of the virtual channels, and in other cases because the involved cryptography is not super easy to implement and hasn't been fully checked. But principally, we could go to any of these versions which increase the security of the protocol at the moment. So that's one of the 2 research questions. How do we make sure that B does not steal our money? The second question was, one step before, how do we even figure out that there is a path from A to C going via B? Sure, if there's only A, B, and C in the network, it's easy. If there's 1 million participants, not so easy. Also an active research area. So this is the list of protocols as it was about 4 months ago. I'm pretty sure there are at least 2 more by now. You don't need to remember all of them. They all have different ideas. The key difference is that some of them assume that you have a snapshot of the complete network, which still works pretty well for something like Lightning with 5,000 nodes or whatever. Will not work well once you're up into the tens or hundred thousands. So the protocols on the other side assume that you do not have the complete overview of everything, and you can still find a path. So I guess one of them is actually mine, Speedy Murmurs, which I still think is probably, if you only have local view, the most promising one. It has a couple of issues with regard to rebalancings of channels that one of my master's students is working on. One observation in general to all of what I said up to now to payment channels is we need to lock collateral, both the sender and the recipient. So this is a bit annoying because you really need to take some of your coins, you need to lock it for this specific application, for this specific person even. Commit chains, which I'm not going to talk about in detail, but they are the other approach to handling off-chain payments, do not need this to this extent. A, when sending something to B, still needs to lock coins, but they're not specific for B. So it's more flexible. It's more like a general debit instead of a specific one. And then you have some operator who conducts the payment, and they then later publish a compressed state of all the transactions they saw to the blockchain. There are a couple of security issues and approaches, which I really do not have the time to go into detail here. And the field is a bit more quiet than payment channels. So it's not super clear if which security guarantees something like Plasma, which is a commit chain, actually has. But this is an alternative if you're really worried about the locking collateral. The interesting aspect is, what do we learn from all the research we've done on payment channels? The first, okay, let's just keep the first 2 bullet points here because this clicker is a bit weird. The first one is you can have scalability without playing around with the underlying blockchain. So you can keep it as it is, and you can just put payment channels on top of it. Of course, you can do both. You can change the blockchain and the payment channels, then you're even faster. But it's something that is easily put on top of it. The second point, which might not be totally clear from what I said because it was very fast, but as soon as you have this multi-hop payments, it's not super clear that this is as privacy preserving as it initially seems. Because initially you're saying we're not putting stuff on the blockchain anymore. Good, we have privacy. It's not quite as simple, and the definitions in these networks are really, really complicated. If you want to know more on this, my student Cedric, who seems to be busy taking photos of me at the moment, is actually working on anonymity and privacy in payment channel networks. There are some trade-offs. You have different approaches. You can use payment channels, you can use commit chains. There's something new I reviewed for a couple of people recently, which does some sort of consortium thing off-chain. And those all have different trade-offs with regard to latency, what amount of collateral do you have to lock, what are the fees that you have to pay. So I think actually those are not competing protocols, but we should use all of them because all of them have different properties and they are great for different applications. So we shouldn't only use payment channel, we should also use commit chains, something like this, off-chain, consortiums, and so on. And the last point was more an interesting thing for economical research. You now have a blockchain and you have payment channels or off-chain payments on top of it. And interestingly, the off-chain payments depend on the transaction value. So they're proportional to how much money you actually spend. The on-chain values depend on what is the complexity, the storage complexity of your transaction, which makes an interesting game in terms of how do you choose the fees and when should you use which of them. But that's more an interesting point for researchers than for actual industry. So how does that relate to all the Syscoin, especially because they were working on this on the substrate work that we heard about today? Well, it kind of falls nicely into this idea that most of the time everything should work well and be fast. Because payment channels usually give you a fast payment unless it fails because there's not enough collateral. And in this case, you can still go back to the original blockchain. You lost like, I don't know, 20 seconds, and that's not much in comparison to the overall payment. The second point is they are easy to add to an existing system. Now, given all the protocols and improvements you just had me talk about, you might not believe that. And in a way, you're right. There's complicated cryptography involved. But the nice thing about them is you can deploy that without having to change much of your underlying system. If you change the consensus algorithm of your blockchain, rolling this out in a live network is a nightmare. This, as we saw with Lightning, can be easily and over time be added to the network because it just uses the already present functionality. So for a developer, this is much neater than playing around with the consensus layer. And the last one is also interesting for a lot of people that I talked to today. They are an option for doing cheap transfer between currencies. You do not if you use the protocol that I just introduced, because that is specific to doing something in a network that only uses one currency. But you can extend that by using additional cryptographic primitives to do payment channels between two different cryptocurrencies. And then you can have easier atomic swaps between coins. So that's the lessons learned from my side for today. I think I was supposed to, I left some time for questions, but Gordon asked me to make it fast.
I'm reminded of the theory of incompressible fluids. And I'll convert this from imperial to metric. But with an incompressible fluid, no matter what you wish, you can't put a litre into half a litre, no matter what you do, no matter how much pressure you apply. We're a bit like that on time this evening, so I would love to invite the opportunity for questions, but I'm afraid tempus fugit. We don't have time this evening for that. But I would have to say thank you very much indeed, Stefanie, for that.